Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the third season of AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app, and we will keep bringing you great conversations. Now, if you're just joining us, we've had a good run. We've published over 100 episodes with some really iconic guests. But we are just getting started. We've got an amazing list of guests scheduled in the months ahead, featuring some real luminaries, newsmakers, disruptors, everyone who's really out there defining the future of work. So stick around. This is your host, Dan Turchin, advisor, Insight Finder, the system of intelligence for IT operations, and CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. We are recording this on January 7th, 2022. Omicron continues to wreak havoc, and I'd say we're more committed than ever to really making hybrid work as or more productive than traditional office work. Technology plays such a critical role in making that happen, and I'm a little biased, but I'd say AI is the backbone of the digital transformation that every organization is undergoing. We'll be expanding on that theme in the weeks ahead. Last week, I talked about three themes that we discussed over a lot of the past 100 episodes. One, AI is about data. Two, responsible AI is the only kind we trust. And three, ambient intelligence is really the future of great employee experiences. Well, today we're joined by an expert who's going to educate us about the first theme, why data quality is table stakes before either of the other themes is even worth talking about. We'll build on conversations we've had recently with Bar Moses, the CEO of Monte Carlo, Derek Steer, the CEO of Mode Analytics, and Peter Fishman, the CEO of Mozart Data. Elliot Shmukler started Anomalo in November of 2018 to help enterprises detect anomalies in their data. A few months back, Elliot and the team raised $33 million from an extraordinary list of investors, including Norwest, Two Sigma, and Foundation. You might recall we've had friends from Foundation on the podcast in the past. Elliot's played a significant role in defining data cultures at iconic companies like Instacart, Wealthfront, and LinkedIn, where he headed up growth teams. Elliot has experienced growth multiple times, truly at a scale few people on the planet have ever seen, which make him exceptionally well qualified to understand the value of data quality monitoring. Today, we'll get a masterclass about the future of data management from someone who is really out there creating it. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Elliot to the podcast. Elliot, let's kick things off by having you share a little bit more about your background and how you got into this space.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. In terms of how I got into this space, well, as you mentioned in your intro, I've been a growth leader at multiple Silicon Valley companies, going back 10 plus years when I led growth for LinkedIn. And one of the things many of your listeners may know is that if you're running growth for LinkedIn or Instacart or Wealthfront, any kind of large scale consumer company, it's a completely data-driven discipline. Everything you're doing day to day is about data. You're launching experiments, you're measuring those experiments, you're deeply analyzing the flows that power your product, how your users are progressing from, step to step in the various flows of signing up and engaging with your product. And you're using those to derive insights that then you're going to try to use to improve the product and try to use to launch further experiments. And very often you're also projecting and forecasting. You're trying to say, okay, here's where we are. Where are we going to be at the end of the year in terms of our growth? And if that's not enough, how can we figure out what we need to do to achieve a higher goal? So I've spent 10 plus years in the product world running these growth teams, but honestly, most of my day was dealing with data. Right? I was trying to get the data that my teams needed, was helping my teams evaluate data, was using data to answer the questions that we needed to answer. So I've typically been, amusingly enough, one of the heaviest users of data warehouses or data tools, right? Myself and my team, of course, at all of the companies I've ever been. I remember at one point at LinkedIn, I actually was the number 2 querier of our data warehouse, me personally. And I forget who the number 1 querier was, but it was probably one of the data scientists, of course. And so this has given me, amazing appreciation for both how great the tools have gotten, how much better they've gotten over the last 10 years, and frankly, Dan, the issues that still remain, the issues that still make it so hard to truly be data driven in a modern organization. And so that's why I'm here.
Saw a talk you gave when you were at Wealthfront, and you talked about how minor changes can make a massive impact on the brand, on adoption. And I've heard stories about, like, I think LinkedIn's a good example, a pixel, a word, a color can, believe it or not, have millions of dollars of revenue impact. Talk about, just at scale, what it means, the value of data quality monitoring.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple of elements here. One, at scale, everything matters, right? If you have millions of users, tens of millions of users, hundreds of millions of users, as companies have today, as the large consumer companies have today, an issue that impacts 1% of those users actually is pretty significant, right? That's a large number. So at scale, everything matters. So that's kind of issue number 1. And so very often, taking it back to data quality, let's say you have a particular platform or a particular set of flows or what have you that's used by a small percentage of your users. Well, chances are, if there's an issue in those flows, unless you're really monitoring your data closely, you're just not going to find it. I'll give you a great example from my Instacart days that relates this to. So Instacart, obviously your listeners probably know, grocery delivery giant, very sophisticated modern company growing very quickly. At one point, essentially stopped collecting all data on our Android platform, in our Android app, right? There was a mistake, a bug was checked in. And we had dashboards everywhere, right? Of every possible metric. And no one actually saw this issue. Because at the time, and this is, of course, has changed, Android was a small percentage of our user base. It was 1 or 2%, right? But of course, it was growing. So before you know it, it was 5 or 6% a few months later. And suddenly it was very odd that conversion rates on Android were 0 in our dashboards. And someone finally figured it out. And it turned out we lost 6 months of data on this platform, 6 months that we could have been leveraging this data to improve our experience on the Android platform. So it actually is a big deal at scale when you have these minor issues because they're hard to detect. And even if they're minor, they impact a lot of people. The other perspective is a lot of these organizations that I've been in are really fast growing, right? They're growing 100%, more than 100% year over year. And so actually a small tweak in your trajectory makes a big difference. Jeff Weiner at LinkedIn, who was the CEO when I was there, used to have this great way of putting it. He said, if you're launching a rocket to the moon and you make, a 1 degree error in your trajectory, well, you're not going to get to the moon, right? You have to be incredibly precise. And these hyper growth companies are the same way, right? If you're trying to, double this year, triple this year, and your conversion rate on some critical flow is a few percentage points off because maybe you didn't do something correctly, or you lost some data, or you mismeasured it, or you missed some insight, well, you're not going to get that goal, right? You're not going to hit that growth path that you're trying to be on. So this is why being very, very close to your data and monitoring everything that's happening and knowing what's going on is so important.
So good segue into a discussion about the importance of detecting anomalies. So presumably, right, that Instacart story, resonates well with Anomalo customers.
Yes.
First off, just, talk us through the unique value proposition of Anomalo.
Right. So what's great about Anomalo is we're an automated way for you to find issues in all of your important data. And so Anomalo is a machine learning based product that you point at any data sets that are important, and it's able to automatically learn what's normal in those data sets. What does typical data look like? And when new data arrives that doesn't match that typical profile, it's able to alert you to potential issues in that data. So to make it very concrete, if we had Anomalo back in those Instacart days and we applied it to our, usage and conversion data, it would have seen that typically on a given day, X% of our users are on Android. And maybe it would have modeled that that's growing at a certain rate. And then it would have noticed if that rate of growth had slowed or if that data had disappeared, right, from the data set. And so that's what we do. And what we help teams find is all kinds of issues in their data that's stale, data that's incomplete, data that has missing pieces, data that's inconsistent with the past. Maybe the distributions of various metrics or numeric fields have changed. We even look for things like relationships between columns and data sets or data sets themselves, and can tell you when those relationships have changed over time, which might be indicative of something being corrupted or misdefined or misapplied in some way.
So you're talking to an audience of geeks, so we're allowed to nerd out here a little bit. So are you doing this using unsupervised machine learning or heuristics or a combination of the two?
Yeah, unsupervised machine learning all the way. We've actually, one of the insights, and I credit Jeremy Stanley, my co-founder, with our core technology, we've managed to turn the problem of data quality into actually a self-supervised learning problem, which has allowed us to approach it in a way where we don't need you to label any issues or provide any feedback on what we're doing.
One of the challenges of doing anomaly detection at scale is that oftentimes patterns are different, let's say for weekends versus weekdays or holidays versus non-holidays.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes you'll want a human in the loop to be able to validate that a pattern is in fact anomalous. What is the Anomalo approach to those situations?
Yeah. So that's one of the great parts of Jeremy and myself having seen this in so many different places before, where things like seasonality is second nature to us, right? We would actually never build a product that didn't take that into account. So as soon as we started, we knew that we needed all those seasonal components, holidays, right? All of those things needed to be incorporated into how we built our models. And we do today. So day of week seasonality, right? Weekends being different than weekdays is a part of how is something that our model looks for, right? And learns. And it's not just weekdays versus weekends. We actually learn something different for each day, right? LinkedIn had this funny day of week pattern where Monday and Tuesday were the big traffic days, and then it would drop off, right? And drop off even more on the weekend. So we'll learn that pattern today. We'll learn that in your data, Monday and Tuesday have more records, right, than the other days. We also do seasonality over the course of the year. Maybe summer is slow for you, but fall is a boom time, right, or vice versa. And then, of course, we'll incorporate holidays and things like that, right? We'll learn what Thanksgiving looks like in your data set, and we'll use that going forward.
So let's take, just going back to Instacart as a possible example, demand for flaming hot Cheetos spikes. Sure. Because it's a new product, and all of a sudden, they're flying off the shelves, and the data, obviously there's not historical data about demand for flaming hot Cheetos, so it's going to take some time for the unsupervised machine learning algorithm to pick up on that trend. How does Anomalo adapt given that there's no training data?
Yeah, absolutely. So our model retrains every day. And so when it sees one of these unexpected spikes, right, and maybe a single product wouldn't do, but maybe a category of products, right? Suddenly, I don't know, frozen yogurt is very popular this year because there's a new product line or what have you. When we see that spike, of course, the first time we see it, right, that's going to look like something is odd. And we're going to send that alert and someone's going to see it and they'll be like, okay, yes, that's okay. We know about it. But the second time the model runs, we already know that this spike has occurred. And so we're going to downplay that spike. So because we retrain very quickly, you typically won't see a second alert on that again. And eventually we'll just believe it to be the new normal.
One of the recurring themes on this show is the human impact of automated decisions. And let me give you another scenario. So let's say Anomalo is being used to monitor heart pumps in a hospital.
Sure.
And you could imagine that there could be very high impact decisions that Anomalo might be making. For example, a false negative, a heart pump goes down and Anomalo doesn't detect it, is a big problem. A false positive where maybe there's noisy alerts generated because Anomalo detects an anomalous pattern, but in fact it's not worthy of action. Both of those could impact a patient's life. What's the responsibility of Anomalo when it comes to making automated decisions that have high impact?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Dan. Right. And obviously every company's and every data set scenario is quite different, right? Some are life and death and some are, less serious. So what we try to do is, have defaults that are a good balance between false positives and false negatives. And that's something we work very hard on so that, when you turn on an anomaly and you point it at a data set, right, we're going to detect the most significant issues in that data set with kind of a balance of noise versus missing potential issues. But then on top of that, you can fine tune what we do, right? So if you have a data set like the heart monitor example, where it's critical that we have no false negatives, you can tell us that, right? You can actually fine tune some of the inputs into our model, or you can actually add specific things for us to look for, 100% of the time, on top of the base monitoring that we do. This was actually a pretty important insight when we were developing the product. We originally built the product as just a machine learning system or just a black box, right? You set it up and we struck a balance between false positives and negatives and you were going to love it, right? But we realized that there were many scenarios where folks actually needed to fine tune because they knew things that we couldn't possibly know, right? To us, that heart monitor data set looks like just like any other data set. We don't know as a software product that it's that important. And so one of the things that allowed our product to be as successful as it has been is adding that ability to kind of fine tune what we do in sort of very easy and simple ways. And if you don't need that fine tuning, if you're fine with our base level monitoring, then great. You don't have to do anything.
We have had interesting discussions with, I'll take one example, Krishna Gade is the CEO of a company called Fiddler that focuses on the explainability of automated decisions. And obviously he's very passionate about the need to not have black box AI-based systems. What's your perspective on the importance of being able to explain the decisions that the unsupervised machine learning algorithms are making?
Oh, absolutely, Dan. We actually are huge fans of explainability, and we have explainability similar to what Fiddler does built into our product. And it's important because it's actually not enough for us to tell you there's an issue detected by our model. That's actually not helpful to the data scientist, the data analyst that owns that data set. They need to know a little bit more about the issue so they can root cause it, so they can figure out what's going on. Is it important? Is it not important? So one of the most important things we've built is we actually have a root cause analysis engine that uses some of the same explainability technologies that you see from Fiddler, that actually gets it down to the exact rows of the data that are tripping the model. And it's saying, like, these rows in your data set, these are the things that appear to be off with them. And that's why you're getting this alert today. And so that's critical.
In the AI community, we often thumb our noses at anything that's heuristics based for good reason. It doesn't scale, it can be very brittle. And yet, you alluded to the fact that sometimes being able to override a decision with some kind of heuristic because it's a special case, it's the frozen yogurt, the flaming Cheetos, whatever, it's something that the model wouldn't know about, is appropriate. Have you instrumented that into the platform, the ability to override an automated decision?
Yeah, we have. Absolutely. In a couple of different ways. One is you can, the obvious things you can do is make things less sensitive, more sensitive, right, to certain situations. But two, we actually do allow you to put rules into the system. And again, this was a surprise for me when we were building the product. As many folks in the AI community think, I thought, well, the model will handle everything. And it turns out that's quite difficult to do. Mostly because we just don't fully understand the business value of the various elements of the data that we're looking at, right? And only the folks on the other side, the data scientists, the executives, the product leaders that are using our product, they know the business value of the various elements and which ones are critical and which ones are not. And so that kind of input into what we're monitoring is essential, right? Because there could be a million anomalies in a data set that you just don't care about, right? And to us, from an ML statistical standpoint, it will look like a great place to send you alerts from. But you, as the user, will know, actually, don't care about that, don't need to monitor that.
Now, roll back the clock a decade, and the work that Anomalo is doing would have been done probably not as effectively, but by data analysts or various other teams. Those roles are changing.
Yes.
Now, fast forward 10 years, when all of these systems that do anomaly detection are mainstream, what does the role of the data analyst look like?
Yeah. No, great question, Dan. And you don't even have to go back 10 years, right? If I think back on my Instacart experience, just a few years ago, some of my star analysts were spending at least 50% of their time chasing down data issues, trying to explain anomalies, something that we do automatically today with Anomalo, or trying to, resolve some data issue that came up months ago and they were trying to reconstruct what happened. So I think, and certainly my hope is that over the next few years, that kind of work disappears. And the job of the analyst, the job of this data scientist becomes, the strategic parts of that role, which is how do I use data to drive value for the product and the business, right? How do I use data to understand what's going on, right? Or generate ideas and insights that could improve the product that we're building or the service that we're offering or the business that we're running? How do I translate data into, actions that my company can take to do better, right? That's the fun part of the job. Chasing down the data and making sure it's okay and making sure it's ready to be used. Machines should be doing that. Software can do that.
So if you're coaching your kids or my kids about the roles that will be future-proof, let's say they're going to school and they want to be, in the data field and they want to be relevant for a long period of time, what are the skills that will never be automated?
Well, to be honest with you, Dan, I think just being able to learn is probably the most important skill out there, because technologies will change, approaches will change. And so you need to be flexible and you need to be able to learn what you need to learn. And that, of course, requires some foundation. You have to be capable in math and numbers, right? If you're going to be in the data field, regardless of what technologies you're using, and you have to be able to read and write and communicate. Those are always going to be, and you have to be able to work with people effectively. Those are always going to be important. But I've definitely, and I have two small children, I've focused on making sure they have a great foundation in those various elements, working with people, math, science, general knowledge around the world, and that they're able to learn what they need to learn.
So you're talking to a lot of entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs who really admire, the fact that you've had a lot of early success. You've signed some amazing customers. You raised money from great investors. What has surprised you most about your shift from being an operator in a larger company to being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, a few things. One, maybe this was a silly thing to be surprised by, but I was just how supportive the whole entrepreneurial ecosystem is. I mean, in the early days, we would ask folks for help and we'd talk to investors and other entrepreneurs. And I don't remember, or even potential customers, I don't remember anyone not being helpful and nice. Up to a point, right? It's not like they joined the team and jumped in, but you can usually count on everyone doing you at least one favor out there in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And that surprised me because, we didn't have much, right? We didn't have traction. We didn't have much of a product. Maybe we had our reputations, which helped, but who knew where we were going to go? So that's probably one of the most surprising. Even potential customers, right? We had a pretty terrible product in the early days, and everyone was pretty nice. They would try it. They would tell us what was working and what wasn't working, right? And of course, that helped us improve. And so that's a pretty amazing thing in the entrepreneurial ecosystem today, and it still surprises me.
So it's clear you learned a ton at previous companies. I mentioned Instacart, Wealthfront, LinkedIn, et cetera. What are some of the lessons that you've had to unlearn that coming out of some of those companies?
Yeah, probably one that's amusing given our conversation is how little data there is when you're running a startup for you to make decisions on. Back in my LinkedIn days, of course, even though it was 100 people when I joined, there were already 1 million users, and there's lots of data coming in. There's lots of things we can use data for. And we are, of course, a very data-driven company. So this pains me that our own decisions, we don't have a lot of data for. And so you have to kind of get creative in gathering evidence. And also you kind of trust your sense of things, or your understanding of the market and of the needs of your customers, and refine those things if you're wrong. So that's been I don't know if it's unlearning, but it's a different way of approaching things than you can do at scale.
You do take for granted the infinite amounts of data that you have at a large company. That's a savvy answer. What's your advice to a younger version of Elliot?
Well, to be honest, Dan, I mean, my life has turned out pretty well, so I don't want to mess, with younger Elliot too much. There's the butterfly effect and all this kind of stuff. But if I could come up with one thing, I would probably tell the younger Elliot to be a little bit more patient. The younger me was always someone who wanted, the next accomplishment, the next, problem, the next innovation to come tomorrow. And some things just take time. And I think, being aware of the fact that things take some time to come together without losing your sense of urgency, of course, would have made the younger Elliot, more satisfied with life.
So I claim that we're still in the early stages of turning every organization into a data-driven culture. But let's assume we're on the way and we're going to get there. Again, arbitrary, but call it in 10 years. What do our lives look like as consumers when organizations have access to mature data analytics platforms, mature, accurate anomaly detection? How do you think that impacts us in our daily lives?
Yeah, in a bunch of different ways. I mean, the obvious one is just the level of personalization that we're able to achieve in our lives is off the scale, right? I mean, folks marvel at Spotify and their auto-generated playlists, or Netflix with its recommendation. Imagine every product is that good in whatever domain it serves. That's definitely possible, right? There's nothing stopping most companies from doing that, aside from having the right tools and making the right investments and having the right teams in place that can manage those stacks. So that's a huge one. Two, fewer weird issues, right? I don't know about you, Dan, but even when I use big products like a Facebook, there's always bugs or small issues that I encounter all the time, right? And we've kind of gotten used to, things sort of break in technology, And, we have to reboot our phone, or, we have to refresh the page every once in a while, or, I have a Tesla, so I have to reboot the car every once in a while to address an issue. If you had incredible data systems that could give you insight into those issues immediately, and you had that telemetry and a way to deal with it, right, and a way to address it quickly, there'd be fewer and fewer of those, right? So that's something I'm hoping for as well, is kind of fewer, smaller issues that today either go undetected, right, or go undetected for a long period of time.
We've had two great guests that come to mind talk about exactly that second issue. Milind Desai is the CEO of Sentry, bug tracking or error monitoring.
Yeah.
And Charity Majors is the CTO of Honeycomb. And both really talked about, what the future of better apps, better services looks like when it becomes easier for mere mortals, ordinary developers to really monitor the impact of their code, again, at scale. And I completely agree with that being a big part of the vision of what's ahead, is that, we as consumers, we can trust the reliability of these services better. I think probably a lot of our listeners don't appreciate that behind the improved reliability is, there's really a lot of interesting developments in software engineering and software development lifecycle management that's going to happen. So good. Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, and we are a Sentry customer ourselves at Anomalo. So I could tell you that a product like that, which is really a way of unifying a lot of the disparate data streams that your software is generating into something that actually makes sense to a developer. I can be like, oh, I understand what's happening here. It's been quite eye-opening. And so my hope is definitely that more and more apps, have systems like that.
There you go, Milind. I'm sure you're listening. You're welcome. free plug on the podcast. Good stuff. Well, Elliot, we're about out of time. It feels like we're just getting started. But before I can let you go, how can the listeners learn more about Anomalo?
Just go to anomalo.com or search for Anomalo or Anomalo Data Quality on Google. And on the site, we have a lot more information and a video demo.
Elliot, this has been so much fun. I hope you'll maybe join us on another episode and we'll talk about some of these trends.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dan.
Well, there you have it. Elliot from Anomalo. Great discussion. This is your host, Dan Turchin, AI and the Future of Work, signing off. But we're back next week with another fascinating guest.